Sorry.
That has been the worst start to a record. That has been the worst start to a possible recording ever.
This is the worst pre-intro. Hey guys, bear death.
See, it's even funnier because I didn't actually stop recording until just a few seconds ago.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so we have our intro sequence right now of
Bear death.
Yeah, everyone who's going to be tuning in, they're going to be like, "Hey, bear death," and they're not going to know the context of it.
They're gonna know exactly the context of it. I bet you.
Yeah. Okay.
Someone will. But it's probably for the best that we don't tell everyone else.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to the InkGuild Podcast, and welcome to the season finale of season 2. It has been a really good time being this consistent with uploading. And we've been uploading every Wednesday, Friday, and all the episodes up until now will be available. And I guess the reason why I'm being a lot more wordy right now than I typically would be is because the episode that we're going to be carrying on with tonight is going to be pretty long, or at least I can imagine it will be. So I'm just going to get some of the stuff that we typically talk about at the end out of the way first. So yeah, thanks everybody for sticking around for season 2 and for the introduction of the shorthand series. Those have been like really interesting for me at least to look back and edit, and hopefully after we take a break for Christmas, because we're all really, really, really tired, we'll catch up in season 3. So as usual, you can find all of our description, or as all of our stuff in the description below, both our InkGuild social media and our personal ones. You can connect with us whenever you want, and hopefully we've got some more exciting stuff planned for the future. But anyway, just thought I'd get all of that out of the way first, because tonight we're talking about our gods and myths. And I'm joined tonight by some 2 very incredible world builders, Alex and Gabe. Do you guys want to say hi?
Oh.
Alex?
Hello.
There we go.
I said hello.
The lag. Okay. So, how it's going to work for tonight is it's going to be, like I said, a very long discussion. And if you were here for the gods, or if you were here for the magic system episode, you will know that we each have our own set time to talk about aspects of our world building. And tonight that's going to be no different. So the speaking order will be me first, then Gabe, then Alex. And depending on how things will work, we'll just see how much we share, because obviously with our info, and because I'm invested in Alex's work, I'm invested in Gabe's work, and the 2 of them are invested in mine. It'll be hard to kind of keep spoilers intact, so we'll try to bear with that, and hopefully you guys can bear with it too. But yeah, I guess let's just get started right out of the way. So I'll be going first. So in previous episodes where we were basically doing a show and tell, my world has plenty of systems, or plenty of characters and magic that I've even yet to incorporate, because I wanted to have the world as full as possible before getting into it. And with that, I've developed the key 9 gods of the world. So there is Alluvia, Linnea, Marnarwe, Adria, Roth, Sane, Thon, Rebillo, and Wild. It's a lot of names, but basically I'll go through each one very quickly. Alluvia is the goddess of parents, so that means basically she is the overall representative. I guess a lot of people, or she is highly renowned across all the continents in my world. Linnea is the goddess of the earth, or I guess goddess of the soil, because obviously earth doesn't exist. She has a lot of very interesting lore for a goddess, which I will get to in a second. Marnarwe is goddess of the light, which also includes goddess of fire. Adria is goddess of the wind, and Roth is goddess of the seas. The five of them make the Sisters of Creation, and it's really only Linnea's story that I've kind of properly honed in on, but again, I'll get to that in a minute. I guess I'm just getting a little bit too excited, but as for the remaining four, who are known as the Brothers of Spirit, Sane is the god of war, Thon is the god of time, Rabillo is the god of youth, and Wild is the god of adventure. So as the Brothers of Spirit, they basically are the attributes of life, basically. So like how people behave how people act freely, how people, a lot of the personal traits, they kind of attest to, Sane, Thon, Wild, and Rabillo, and sometimes Alluvia. But as for the Sisters of Creation, they're kind of responsible for creating the planet. Basically, they're responsible for how the planet breathes, how it moves, how it behaves during the day and night, how the animals respond to it, and whatever. And I've basically called them the 9 gods of Paraiso. It used to be Paraiso, but I think Paraiso is a much simpler name or way of saying it right now, so that's just Paraiso. And I'll get to their story in a second, but basically, the 9 gods were not originally gods. In fact, they were all mortal at one point, and how they came to be was actually during a very, very terrible war early on in the planet's history. And I guess to get into the first myth that I want to talk about, originally for Vuhyn, it was created by a single man, or a single entity, who I have called Botala. So Botala, I think. And Botala originally was, in respects, the god. He created the planet, he created the solar system, and whatever. But suddenly, along his creation came a rebellion by a group of, I don't want to say a group of thing, because they were not in any way mortal as the gods were, but basically they were evil spirits, who I have called the Sanatas. And I'll get to them in a minute, but yeah, the Sanatas basically brought Botala to near death. And on his deathbed, Botala sacrificed the remainder of his power to 9 chosen individuals to carry on his legacy and essentially defeat the Sanatas. And that's what they did. So I've yet to come up with a proper term for this first myth. I've basically just been called the origin of Vuhyn. But I wanted to think, like, as a really quick thing, like I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just like a really basic creation story. Like I wanted to make sure that there was something more interesting there. So yeah, start off a planet with a war, I guess, or start off like the origins of a planet with a war. And what had ended up happening with these Sanatas was that most of them were locked away. There are 17 Sanatas, or 17. There are 10 Sanatas in general, or in total. Each one is representative of a pretty evil trait, but I guess I'll go through them in order. So there is Aeron, so Aeron. I'm gonna change the name. I'm not really sitting comfortably with that name anymore, but basically, yeah, Aaron is the king. He and Gaithan, who is his queen, basically they were the ones who were like, let's take over what Otala has started, and so they did, along with the help of their children. Basically, I've called it children, but I don't know if I want to change that dynamic. But basically, Aaron and Gaithan so far have their children. Fee, who is the Sonata of Shadows, Undead, and Necromancy. Sisi, the Sonata of the Blind and Misguided. Also, I guess the Sonata of Knowledge. Vunaria, the Sonata of Suicide, Depression, and Hopelessness. Orzum, the Sonata of Beasts and Animosity. Orma, the Sonata of Insects and Vile Creatures. Voloma, the Sonata of Deceit and Lies. And Glide, the Sonata of Domination and Control. I deadass forgot about one. So I listed off the sonatas, but I forgot. Yeah, I forgot one, and she is named Ophelia. She is the Sonata of Fragility and Illusion. Good job, me. I really don't know how to speak. So on top of these sonatas, there came the Malu, which, with their help, basically took over the world for a good majority of time. And the Malu are basically the 7 deadly sins. Because I can't resist writing that shit, and it's always good shit. So you have.
I feel that though.
Yeah. So
I'm the same way, Dean. I feel that.
Yeah. So you have Ulissa, who is the Malu of Wrath. Ruv, the Malu of Pride. Kaleo, the Malu of Gluttony. Zelos, the Malu of Envy. Gradik, the Malu of Greed. Zale, the Malu of Sloth. And Deus, the Malu of Lust. So when trying to defeat all 17 of these evil beings, the 9 gods basically had to really work together, because it wasn't just one man. It was obviously a team, basically, of random individuals at that given point. And with that, when they eventually did manage to defeat him, they had to make sure that they wouldn't ever, or like none of their presence. Basically, the Sonatas wouldn't ever have a chance of resurfacing again. So they all locked them away in basically what is Pandora's box in my world. I've yet to give it a proper name yet, because I haven't written it into the main narrative yet. But supposedly all 17 have been kept away. And to make sure that the gods have some kind of overlook over Vuhyn, they created, I've called it the Mystic program, but it's basically the Mystics. And if I've described anything before on this podcast, whenever we were sharing bits of our world, the Mystics are basically the vessels of the gods themselves. I think whenever the planet really needed help that was beyond saving, basically, then the gods would appoint their own respected individuals, and typically they would go after, or typically they would anoint someone that is within their their birth, like that was within their, how do I say this, like they would typically choose someone that they are familiar with. So that is typically based on race. And I'm jumping back a little bit, but basically the gods, like I had said, were once mortal, and they were each coming from a different part of the planet at the time. So Olivia is a Zuran, so she comes from Zur. Linnea is Illyrian. Mernawe is Hymnic. Adria is Chaotic. Roth is a Phoric. Sane is a Troxian. Thawne is Chaotic. Rabilo is Aranam. And Wild is Illyrian. And I know that's a lot of terminology, but basically it was a very diverse group that had to band together and save the world. And they decided to keep that, so that not one sole continent was responsible for the fate of the world, basically. And they each appointed their mystics based on certain attributes that reflected their quality. So no matter who they appointed, the people could see the god, or they could know that that was hand pointed by the gods, right? So Alluvia was typically a very gentle, humble woman. She cared a lot for her teammates and was often the one who was often the leader. So whenever Alluvia appointed a mystic, she was almost always appointing like a very strong, capable leader. Linnea has a lot more. I want to say sass, but like she definitely like is very headstrong. So she would typically appoint a mystic that is also very headstrong. Manawe is very spirited. She has a lot of energy. So, that kind of goes on and on. And as I think I mentioned this before, but if I haven't, then I'll get to it in a second. But basically, mystics were hardly ever appointed. Only really during key points throughout the planets or throughout Vuhyn's story, basically when the world needed it. So like if there were giant monsters, if there were or if there was like world-ending floods or something, that's when they would appoint a mystic. And it was even rarer to have all 9 of them down at once, because that would mean basically that would be the end of the world. Right? If only 1 or 2 mystics can solve a problem, great. But suddenly if all 9 of them are down there, then it's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So the only time that they were close to that, and this is another myth, or this is another story, actually. I think it's God's myth and stories at this point, but it ties into a very critical role with Linnea's story. So Linnea, as of the start of Xeno, is very, very much outlawed. Her worship is completely outlawed. No one in Illyria openly worships her. And it's been generations since the events of what I'm about to talk about. But basically, if you're caught worshiping her, or even acknowledging that she exists, you're dead. Because of an event that I've called the Eternal Square. So picture a fifth age Illyria. So think of a time period equivalent to maybe the 1500s. There was a rampant plague going on that was supposedly linked to the Sanatas. Maybe one of them had gotten out. So at the time, only 4 out of the 9 had basically gone down to deal with it. So there was Linnea, there was, I think, Marnawe, Roth, and Thon. If I'm remembering correctly, if I'm remembering those correctly. Oh no, it was Sane. Yeah, so the 4 of them went down at the time to kind of help deal with the mass panic. So they each appointed their mystics. Linnea's mystic was a princess of Illyria, and for the life of me, I can't remember her name. And it's part of an old draft, so it's probably going to be outdated anyway. But yeah, Linnea appointed a mystic or a princess that she saw a lot in her, but I guess that's when everything started to go wrong, because Linnea really started to empathize and sympathize and basically connect with the princess. And that's not to say that the gods can't have relationships with their mystics, because basically it's a relationship that, you have to mutually agree to participate in, I guess. But basically Linnea got attached, and so attached that she was able to be convinced to, or like she was apparently convinced that there was a solution in opening Pandora's box, basically, and that would cure the plague. And so she did. With because it was the princess's face who did it, and not, and it was a mutual decision between the 2 of them to do it, like having been brainwashed to do it. All of Illyria turned on them, especially Linnea, because obviously as a god, like, what the fuck? Like, you can't, like, why did you just damn the whole world because of an intuition, right? Like, you were supposed to have known better. And not to get too into specifics about, opening the box, because but as a consequence, the princess was set to be executed. she was lined up in her courtyard. So the princess had her head on a chopping block in front of the courtyard of her peers and in front of her people. And as the axeman was set to like bring the axe down, that is when suddenly Linnea screamed just once, and suddenly not only did the princess's head come off, but suddenly that entire square or that entire courtyard was frozen completely in stone. That just made things worse, because suddenly people who were looking on it from the other capital or from the other countries, they caught word of it and they were like, holy shit, like a god did that. They couldn't trust her anymore.
Seems like a fair reaction.
Yeah, so they could not trust Linnea anymore, so they outright abolished her worship. And I guess to catch up to speed, the event of Porter's story happens a long time after that all transpired. I think it was the start of Xeno begins basically with Porter trying to find Linnea, because Linnea is the one who contacted her so Linnea is the one contacting her, and because of events in the story, Porter really has no other choice but to listen to her. So she goes down to, or she tracks down some of the key locations of Linnea's temple across Illyria, and she arrives at the final one in Amari. It's underneath what was once her temple. So Linnea's temple was allowed to be built by the ancient Illyrians to, for people to to discreetly worship it, but basically it was a plot, and I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so I have an excerpt on it, so I'll read what happens when Porter and Magna discover the courtyard. So keep in mind, this is all this is pretty much all underground. So, stretched as wide as 6 cars laying front to back, the courtyard's overtaken by the unnatural overgrowth of the temple's gardens. Thick, untrimmed bushes blush with the goddess's patron flower. Each one of the towering maple trees scattered around the area graze the roof of the ravine, and to their right, a tremendous waterfall spews out of a giant cavity, pouring into an open crevice below. Giant glass crystals, each 1.5 meters long at least, are buried into the walls of the cave, giving the area a beautiful cast of teals, amethysts, and golden yellows. Porter stands at the edge of the courtyard, a fraction of her boots submerged in murky, swamp-like water. The bushes are up to her waist at their highest. The sweet, potent aroma from the dozens of lisianthus floods her noses. She takes in a deep breath, closing her eyes to relish her arrival to the temple, but then she opens them. The temple walls bear the wounds of savage cannon fire. The ceremonial banners once waving above the entrance were torn off and laid scattered around the area. The pair of stone doors are in pieces, stained in centuries-old blood. Porter walks into the swamp-like field. Scattered across parts of the courtyard, dozens of skeletons, all dressed in mauve robes. Most lay on their stomach with arrows in their back. Some died with an ancient sword or spear plunged into their body. Some were in pieces, but all of them had parts of their robes torn and were close to building supplies: hammers, nails, wood, planks, or stone bricks. She turns her head away. They must have been promised the space to build a temple, but even that was something the rest of Illyria rejected. Walking further into the courtyard, Porter spots another set of remains on the stairway. The person was a priest, based on the bloodied mauve and gold robes. The skull is detached from the rest of the body and isn't anywhere close. A pair of arrows are left where the heart used to be, but compared to the others, the robes are still intact. Shit. Porter blurts softly, barely a whisper. So, it's that kind of resentment towards Linnea's actions. Like, her worshippers weren't even allowed to, they were tricked into some kind of false hope that they could worship their goddess in peace. But it was almost immediate. Like, as they were building the temple, basically, I have this scene where it's like, suddenly the entirety of Valyria basically just tries to destroy everything. But I guess at some point they must have just stopped. So that brings us to one part of the story. The other part has to do with further spoilers into the story, so I'll try to be as careful as possible, but because it was Linnea who was responsible for opening the box, that has to deal with the Sanatic magic that I haven't really talked about in the previous episode, but basically the Sanatas can possess people too, and that is for life. So whereas the gods are able to possess, they're able to anoint their mystics and become one for as much time as need be. As soon as you've bound yourself to a Sanata, then that's basically for life, and the only way that you can get rid of them, or you can break that bond, is to die. But you're pretty much entitled to the same, I guess, benefits that a mystic would. So if a mystic is given the powers of the gods, then vessels of the Sanatas are given the powers of very evil people or very evil creatures. And as I listed earlier on in the description, it really depends. So like the vessel for Fee, the Sanata of Shadows, is able to like wisp away into nothing basically and then reappear out of nowhere. Or at least, I haven't set that in stone yet. Saisi, the goddess of, or the Sanata of knowledge, is able to access a lot of very forbidden things. They're able to like not just access forbidden knowledge, but like really look into the past and present for answers.
Shadow travel?
Yeah, something like that. But, and it's, a lot of them are still very much up to my creation at that point. There are a lot of ones that are very simple. So Orzem and Orma, who are the Sanatas of beasts and fire and insects and other really disgusting creatures, that basically just allows you to like take control of them if you're the vessel of them. So like you're basically a beast master, and it's nasty. But
turn into Ant-Man.
Yeah, basically. So with all of this being said, and I'll quickly wrap up. I've been so tightly focused on only writing certain sections of things right now. Like I've only drawn, or I guess I've only really written, or I've only written in Linnea properly. In my book, I've alluded to different, or to other gods and other and to the Sanatas. But even then, the gods are just mentions. There's only a few displays of some of their power, but not completely. And the Sanatas, basically, that's still being built up. So their secrets are still wildly unknown. And due in part because I haven't properly worked on most of them yet, but also because when you've unleashed millennia's worth of evil into the world, and they were able to kill the originator of the planet and everything that they know, and or everything that the world knows about, right? Like there is so much world-ending potential there that I think I have to start to properly balance. But I think that's it for me. I don't have a thing. I didn't really have much to share.
My brain is
Sorry, go.
Sorry, the leg is a problem. I was gonna say my brain is racing now with all the possibilities and what this means for the stuff you revealed in the scenes last week, and this is so cool.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I hope everyone's enjoying this episode of InkGuild Show and Tell. But yeah, it's. As expansive as this world has been so far for me, I think I haven't really had the chance. I think, like I said, I haven't really had the chance to work in every single proper description. A lot of the things, such as the vessel for the Sanatas, that is something that is still very. Do I want to say raw? Yeah, I'll say that. So like it's basically like it's basically just been written, but it hasn't been properly developed into anything yet. Whereas the story arc with Linnea, that is obviously like a huge majority or a huge factor going into this first book, because she is the one who her story and Porter's story really do intertwine into it, because not only, I guess what I'm excited for mostly when I'm writing Linnea as a character is because she may be a god, but starting out mortal gives me all the possibilities of really rounding out a solid character. So, because they're mortal, they each, like, just because they are almighty doesn't mean that they are, all knowing and all, it doesn't really write them in as solid gods. Like, they are they're still capable of emotion. They're still capable of like reacting how we do, and that is almost completely unpredictably. And the decision of, and likewise, the gods can also be manipulated, and that is what happened to Linnea, and that's as a consequence of that, she has lost her worship. So when I do properly start getting into that, I am super excited to develop it, because Linnea is a very pivotal character. And I think that's it for like the meaty stuff. Like I'm gonna quickly fire through like a few other small things that kind of makes developing all of this really cool. So like all the 9 gods except for one is kind of named off a few friends of mine from high school, and I won't name them off right now, but basically, yeah. So Linnea is the only original god that I've came up. Everyone else is kind of a rewording or some kind of allusion to friends of mine from high school. Cute. For the Sanatas, I think there are some other references. So Ophelia is from, I guess, fragility and illusion. I was thinking of Hamlet's Ophelia when I was conceptualizing this character.
You and your Shakespeare, Dean.
Yeah. Vuhyn as the Sonata of suicide, depression, and hopelessness. Basically, I just took the word vulnerable and pumped out a name. Orzam and Orma are also, I guess, like anagrams. Is that what it is? But like, it's basically just like taking apart a few last names from a few friends of mine and jambling it. And Voloma is supposed to be Malvolio, again from Shakespeare. I don't know why I made him the Sonata of deceit and lies when Malvolio in Twelfth Night is a bumbling, serving idiot, but then again, who isn't in?
I mean, he gets deceived.
I think, yeah, maybe that's it. Anyway, and then Glide is it's basically alluding to Sir Percival Glide from The Woman in White, who, like, it's The Woman in White is a book that was later adapted into a musical, which I did in high school, and Sir Percival Glide is a dick, a very controlling dick. So the whole story with him is like he's trying to marry said character for like control of her estate or something. And it's funny because the Malu actually they were originally supposed to be Sanatas, but I thought it would be more interesting to make them their own separate branch, as like I guess as like their own creatures, basically their own entities. So you have the Sanatas, and then the Malu are basically servants or pets to the Sanatas. And actually the Malu was taken from a project I did in grade 10. So it's going to be a bit of a weird explanation, but bear with me. So as part of our grade 10 curriculum, we had to do a Greek presentation on some myths within it, and again, please bear with me, but like for our group, or for my group, we basically created our physical representations of the 7 sins. And the names that I just listed off Ulissa, Ruv, Kaleo, Zelos, Gradic, Zal, and Deos. First of all, I'm probably going to change because that's a bit outdated now, but like those were the 7, like these were the 7 that I had as part of that grade 10 project. And I couldn't let it die, so I decided, hey, you know what? I'm going to adapt it, but I don't know where I'm going to adapt it in the story. But I think that's it on my end. Don't really have much else to share. Like it's a very small group, and I don't know if in the development of the narrative and of future stories, I don't know if it's all going to change or if it's going to or if it's all going to be this like the same, but like the one thing that I can share is that Linnea's story is probably the one that I'm most focused on right now. Ooh, I completely forgot to mention this because I think it's the last detail because it's so small of a thing. There isn't really a lot of like overall significance to it, but each of the 9 gods has their own flower. So
that's always fun.
Yeah. So Linnea has the Lysianthus. Alluvia has a gold rosella, so it's a gold rose, I think. Marnawe has the lilium, so it's an amber flower. Adria has the sylvus, which is, I think in my head, so these are all real flowers, but in my head I've kind of imagined them differently. So Adria's sylvus has silver streaks. Roth is the iced gentian, so it's a gentian flower with very strong light blue highlights because light blue is a color typically associated with ice in a lot of fantasy. Sains is the red amaryllis. Thon is a brown cympidium. I think that's how you'd say it. Yeah, cympidium. Rubilos is the green gladios, and Wilds is actually the most unique because these flowers I think I completely made up, and they're the lanternas. So they're basically bioluminescent flowers that come in 3 different kinds. So there is the kiln, there's the Ganos, and then there's the Aldes, and the Aldes are the rarest ones. And as a fun thing, each one of those 3 is a reference to the Legend of Zelda. So Kiln is Link, Ganos is Ganondorf, and Aldes is Zelda. So,
cute.
Oh, it's like an anagram. Oh, that's fun.
Yeah. So
it took me a second to figure out what Aldes had that. Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So that's been my presentation on my gods and myths. I hope you guys enjoyed.
Hell yeah.
Any
round of applause.
Thank you. Anything kind of catch your eyes, guys, or?
I like the idea. I love the whole thing about the that sort of forbidden religion. I always dig that shit. That's just always cool. And like the history of her with the stone circle, that's cool as fuck. I love the idea of like as the head is coming off, everything around her just turns to stone. That just conjures up like a really cool image in my head.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted like
it's very, very like martyr. Very like martyr. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It sounds like a story you would hear about a saint.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But instead of it being for the greater good, it ended up being
it's like apocalyptic Jesus.
Yeah, basically. And I was trying to find some way of like properly implementing that because I think obviously I think the legend with Pandora's box is if you open the box, you unleash the entire world's evils.
Yeah.
And that, I think, obviously has affected, like, I think I took inspiration from this from God of War 3's campaign, but basically when you open up the evils of the world, it infects everybody. And I didn't want to hold the gods as an exception to that. Like, with the gods comes their own fears and their own they're affected by opening the box in their own right. So I gotta come up with a different name instead of just Pandora's box, but basically you guys know what I mean. So
So the art that you sent are those of the gods?
Yeah. So I'll be flashing up images hopefully during the episode, but basically for those listening, I've attached in different images about how I've kind of envisioned how the gods looked. For reference, Linnea is purple. Or Linnea's is in purple. Myrnawe's is amber orange. Roth is blue. Adria is gray and silver, and Alluvia is gold.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a bit hard to tell, but basically, yeah. So if you guys are looking through the Discord right now, each color is attributed to the god's overall motif. So basically, as goddess of the light and as goddess of fire, Myrnawe is all completely in red. As goddess of parents, and basically that entitle, I say goddess of parents, but basically goddess of life. Having that much responsibility, Alluvia is in gold. Goddess of the soil, I'm not really sure why I attributed that to purple or mauve. I think I just like the color, but yeah, that's representative of Linnea. Adria is gray/white. Most likely it's attributed to the wind. And Roth, because it's goddess of the seas, it's different shades of blue.
I don't know if this was intentional or not.
Cool.
But I love how in the picture you sent for Lenora, am I saying that right?
Linnea,
that's right. For Linnea, her wings are sort of like giving me like seraphim vibes. That's I don't know if that's intentional or not, but it's cool as fuck.
the one with 3 sets of wings is in gold, and that's Alluvia.
Okay, so I'm colorblind then.
Yeah. It's okay. So yeah, I think it was intentional at the time because she is I've called her the god, but she's pretty much universally loved across the planet, so that's why I kind of made her the importance.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I touched on this actually, but with each of the gods, it varies depending on which region of who worships who, and I haven't properly divided it yet, but the ones I know for sure is that Illyria is worshipping all 8 except Linnea. Him, where Magna is from, is worshipping, I think, exclusively Myrnawe, but there's no set rule against that, so they can pretty much worship whoever. I know in Zur they very much openly praise Alluvia, but is also very much open to contention. And I think for Chaos, I think it's only really worshipping Adria. I don't think there's only one continent so far that doesn't worship any gods, and that's Belua. And the reason why is because Belua is, I think I've said in a previous episode, but basically it is an island of savages. So very, so I guess people who are like, they don't really believe in any of the gods. They kind of are doing their own thing, and it's the kind of doing their own thing where if you trespass on that island, you're basically dead. Yeah, in one way or another, each of the gods are.
Savages is such a loaded word, though. Savages is such a loaded word, though. Always makes me so uncomfortable.
Yeah. I say savages just because in my mind they were like different thing. They were like different like humanoid creatures basically that were very monster-ish one way or another. So it was like goat legs or something. But that I haven't developed that land properly yet. And I'm using savages obviously as a placeholder name. So if I come up with a better name, then we'll get to that. But yeah, that's my gods and myth system. Then let's move on to your magic system, dude. So is it I'll just let you take it away.
Okay, so I'm sort of going to go in the reverse that you went, because like I said in the pre-intro, it's basically I don't know how to explain my gods without also explaining like some of the myths in the series I'm talking about is the Night Reaver saga. I mentioned this briefly on the podcast a couple other times for those listening. Basically explaining the gods in this series is super difficult without also explaining the myths, so I'm just going to go through them both at the same time. Essentially, before I get into anything else, it's important to understand how the universe in this series works. So there's 3 planes of reality that are observable. The first one is the construct, and this is where all life exists. This is where people exist. This is where creatures exist. This is where planets and galaxies exist. This is basically the known universe. This is in this world is known as the construct. In the plane above the construct, you have a world that's called the dream, and the dream is sort of a spirit dimension. It's a dimension that exists above reality. It's not a planet necessarily, but if you went there, you might think you were on a planet. But it's an essentially never-ending land and never-ending, like, essentially paradise. It's a paradise. It's basically like there's spirits and there's these giant creatures that would dwarf planets in comparison to them, called dreadnoughts, that wander around the dream and sort of exists there. And below the construct is a realm called the Abyss. And the Abyss is essentially this universe's version of hell. But instead of there being like a sort of a karmic system, all souls that die go to the Abyss. And what happens when you go to the Abyss is that your soul, if you die and you carry any regret or hatred or despair when you die, you will essentially wander the planes of the Abyss until you have come to a resolution with those things with yourself, at which point you will find the center of the Abyss, which is a giant spiritual tree. And essentially you will the people in this world will place their hand on the tree, and the tree will sort of sap away their despair and their hatred and their agony, and their soul will ascend to the dream. By this point, they will have been in the Abyss far too long to remember their previous lives, so it sort of doesn't matter. Like, it's not like you can resurrect someone by bringing them out of the dream, because they wouldn't be themselves anymore. They would be a completely different entity. But so that's how that works. That's super important. Now, how this universe came to be is there are two sort of, you could call them like the gods. The first god, which you could call the creator, is a creature called the Leviathan. It's a massive planet-sized whale-like creature with it's not exactly a whale, because that would be rather weird if there's just a whale floating around in space. It's just whale-like. And essentially how the Leviathan works is that it is just constantly creating life and the universe around it. It isn't doing any of this intentionally. It is essentially in a constant state of accidental creation. And in its existence of accidental creation is the only being that exists in the construct at this point. It creates the character that I sent a picture to the Discord earlier, Bugstick Man, who, his name is not Bugstick Man. His name in the world is Eden. He is the other character who could be described as like the one true god. Now, when Eden was created, he's essentially in the endless void of space, with nothing around him but faint stars and distant planets. And for millions of years, he essentially just floats around space not knowing what his purpose is, not knowing why he exists, and not knowing what his reason for being is and why he was created, until eventually he and the Leviathan cross paths. He realizes that the Leviathan was the creature that created him, as he can see planets and stars that are just forming from the gases spewing out of the Leviathan's blowhole. And he asks the Leviathan why he was created, and the Leviathan is sort of puzzled by this. He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand what Eden is. He doesn't understand how he's created Eden, because the Leviathan's not a creator. He's not a conscious creator. He's just a creature that accidentally creates as it exists. So as the Leviathan tells Eden this, Eden is met with an overwhelming disappointment and decides to take it upon himself to create a purpose. So he decides that if there's not going to be a purpose for his creation, then he is going to create, and he is going to take these random scattered elements the Leviathan has created, and he's going to form them into life. And so for 10 billion years, or however, an eternity, let's just say an eternity, he goes through space, gathering elements and materials, forming them into planets piece by piece, until eventually there's a cohesive universe formed, and Eden stands idle and content with this universe he's created. Until one day, another creature comes to him, a third entity. And this creature is unlike the Leviathan and Eden entirely. It's a little bird, it's a little raven with blood-soaked wings, and it comes to them and informs them that there's something new in the universe. There's something more than planets and stars. And the Blood Raven shows Eden that on one of the worlds he's created, on Ylldrix, there are people. There are people wandering around. There are animals, but more than that, there's life that is creating civilizations and towns, and there's like communities and stuff on it. And Eden is just fucking amazed at this. He is completely in awe of this idea of civilization and community. And he sees that in this world, people procreate, and people don't just procreate to continue a species, but they procreate to create a legacy and to create something new. And Eden decides that more than just planets, he needs to make something new. So he travels to the dream, to the paradise realm, and he conjures up the prominent elements of the dream. And these are death, forest, wind, sun, moon, war, and sex. And he forms these elements into 7 creatures who will become the gods in this world. These are the 7 gods. They are hang on, I'll pull up their names. They are Corsho, the god of death; River, the god of war; Paradise, the god of sex; Solaris, the god of the sun; Nocturna, the god of the moon; Gilgamesh, the god of wind; and Byzantia, the god of the forest god. So Eden creates these essentially 7 children, and he builds just for them these entire planets where they can exist, they can have kingdoms, they can thrive, they can be gods, and they can thrive in their element. And as they all leave, once again, an overwhelming emptiness fills Eden, because he realizes that he's just alone again. He hasn't created anything new. He's just created an iteration of godlyhood. So instead of the dream, Eden travels down to the abyss, down to the tree, and he gives this tree life. And this tree, and instead of a beautiful, godly human, this little creature comes out. It's ghostly. It's strange looking. It has 3 eyes. One of them is like a shrunken eye under its left eye, and its right eye is like a sunken hole. This creature does not have a name. No one, never gave it a name, but anyone in this world who speaks of this creature, of the daughter of the abyss, only refers to it as the last, meaning the last creature that God ever created.
Oh, that's so
and this,
cool.
she's known as this because as she was created, God decided that he wasn't going to give her godlyhood, that he was going to raise her as his daughter. And so he did that. He sort of took from what he learned from humans and raised her as his daughter. He gave her a home and he gave her fatherhood. But the seven divines were furious about this because they felt cheated. They felt that in spite of all of their creations on their worlds, that Eden had created them, that they were still missing something, and that was his power to create, the power to create this universe that was around them. And they felt that when Eden's time came, there was no question about it, he would pass his power on to the last. He wouldn't give it to any of them because he doesn't really talk to them. They're not on speaking terms as a family. So the seven divines came together and decided to try to kill the last. They ultimately failed. I can't get super into details here with a lot of this stuff because unfortunately, I would be delving into spoilers there. But so the seven divines come together to try to kill the last, and they fail. But the last is absconded to Ylldrix. She's separated from Eden and essentially trapped in the human world. And when humans come across her, they're immediately horrified by her grotesque, inhuman appearance, and they think that she's like a monster. And so then they too try to kill her. Of course, unlike gods, these are mere humans. So when she goes to defend herself, she basically obliterates the entire village. And after this, she's completely distraught at the destruction that she's created. And Eden comes down to her. Now, Eden is seeing all the destruction that she's caused, and the seven divines are behind him, and they're telling him that this is the cost of his mistake. He created a creature out of the abyss. He created a creature out of pure, all of humanity's despair and rage and hatred. And so, as the last goes to take Eden's hand, she sees in his eyes that he has the intention to kill her, to sort of get rid of her and put her out of her misery, or put humanity out of its misery by having her exist. In that moment that she sees Eden's betrayal, basically something in her snaps and Cataclysm is erupted. Almost all of Eden's creation, almost the entire universe is basically destroyed in what is almost instantaneous. The seven divines and Eden, using basically most of their power, they conjure these 8 chains, and they, unable to kill the last, they essentially trap the last. They bring her down to the abyss, and they chain her to the tree and put her in an endless slumber. Well, Eden goes back to mend his universe. All the seven divines' planets and their homes and their kingdoms they've all been destroyed, and left powerless and without a home, Eden constructs for them fortresses on Ylldrix where they can essentially just live without. They don't have kingdoms anymore. They basically just have big fuck off towers now. So some time goes by and things are okay. Things are okay on Ylldrix. Ylldrix is recovering from what, as far as humans are concerned, was a completely inexplicable cataclysm that destroyed all civilization and sent humanity back to square one. And so about 1,000 years go by until one other surviving race. Oh, fuck, I completely skipped over an important step here. So the Leviathan saw all of the Leviathan saw all of this and saw all of the horrors and all the pain that his accidental creation caused, and started basically crying. And his tears, as they fell through time and space, just hardened and freezing. They fell through time and space, and eventually they reached Ylldrix. And when they reached Ylldrix, they formed into the dirt, and people have started to evolve with these in their systems. And these tiers became to the Ylldrix people. They are known as the Leviathan scales, which are what powers magic, essentially. Now, 1,000 years after the cataclysmic event, humanity has formed into a bunch of different countries. So Titania has been formed. The other major countries in Ylldrix have been formed, and life is sort of getting on. Am I choppy again?
No, you're good.
Okay. So life has begun to sort of get to where it was before the cataclysm. There are now these minor sort of medieval civilizations existing, and this is where we get into like the first major myth in this universe, which is the myth of Azazel. So in one of these kingdoms called Obsidia, there is a man named Azazel, and Azazel is essentially a broken man. He's at the point where his story starts. His two children have just drowned, basically in a frozen lake after the ice broke through. So he's essentially a broken man when his story starts. Now, at the same time as this is happening, there is other things afoot in the cosmos. There is another species that survived the cataclysm called the Alluvion. Now, while Ylldrix survived the cataclysm by sheer luck, the Alluvion survived the cataclysm through force of will. They were simply a race that existed that was strong enough to survive such a devastating cosmic event. And now their species has become sort of addicted to the power of Leviathan scales, and their homeworld was sort of they had the reservoir of them, but they find out that Ylldrix is sort of like this planet chock full of Leviathan scales. So the Alluvion, they come to Ylldrix and start this massive war of extinction. This is I have in my timeline, this is called the Era of Extinction. So the Alluvion basically go to war with the entire planet to get this rare cosmic power. And Eden, watching this, basically powerless now due to almost all of his life energy being transferred to the chains that hold the last. He's basically powerless. So he and the Seven Divines agree that Ylldrix has to be protected, but they can't directly do it. So they try to find someone who can. They try to find someone who is potentially power enough to be able to do it. And in their search, they find Azazel. And Azazel, much like Eden is a man looking for meaning. He is basically a broken man just looking for something to live for. And the Seven Divines and Eden, they come and give it to him. They say, we're going to grant you power to stop this horrible threat. And and Azazel is more than eager to accept. His mentality is basically, even if like this war kills me, that would be totally fine. Life is shit right now. So Azazel, along with a group of his other companions, essentially fight this a decade-long war across the world with the Alluvion. I can't get into the specific details here because one of the books I'm planning on writing basically covers this, so I don't want to get into like specific spoilers. But what I can say, like, that is known information to the world by the time the main plot of the books picks up, is that all of Azazel's sort of party, I guess you could call it, they're all dead. And Azazel's left the only one standing, but they all died in an axe that turned the tide in the war and destroyed a great mass of the Alluvion fleet. So then, once again, broken and left with nothing, Azazel spends 200 years wandering Ylldrix on a campaign of rage, just slaughtering any surviving Alluvion he can find. And eventually comes to the conclusion that he's been alive for 200 years doing nothing but war, and realizes he can't die. The power that Eden and the gods granted him has forbidden him from death. So once the last Alavan dies, he's essentially back to square one, back to wandering Ylldrix to find a meaning. And eventually he meets this woman named Lilith. Lilith becomes aware of Azazel's true nature, but she's not mortified by it. And Azazel decides to abscond himself to a quiet life with Lilith until, naturally, because Azazel's a poor fuck, she's horribly murdered by bandits. And
oh no.
Yeah. Azazel is at this point just like, Azazel has given up the idea of rage, he's given up the idea of war, and he goes to the bandits and basically begs for death. And when the bandit's arrow hits him in the heart, he once again realizes that he can't die, and that the gods have basically forbidden him from having the death that he wants. So he kills the bandits, and as he's left off covered in blood, he sets off to essentially kill the gods, not knowing that by killing them, the chains keeping the last at bay will be severed. That's basically it.
Oh,
Cut to 500 years later. The year is 2032, and the actual story starts. Yeah, so not super complicated, but I'm trying to think if I skipped over anything. There's like some lore on Ylldrix, but like that's basically just like there's like wars going on Ylldrix. Ylldrix basically just ever since the Alavan came and people became magically empowered. It's basically a planet in a near constant state of war.
Mm-hmm. If I may ask, how long did it take you to develop this thing? Because for me, I forgot to touch on it when I was speaking, but basically it was the gods in my world started coming up, I think almost immediately when I was working on turning Xeno into a fantasy story.
For me, I worked backwards. Azazel was the first character that I came up with because he was my villain.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the idea of Azazel's villain, but I didn't know what his motivations were, and I didn't know what he was doing. And then I decided to sort of work backwards, and then I came up with the Alavan War and the Last and the Gods, and sort of built that around having Azazel as the villain. Because for the longest time with the series, I've had no idea what Azazel's like actual plan was. It's essentially the idea that I've always had is that Azazel is just a sad fuck and he's a bad guy, and I've essentially built from there with the gods and stuff.
Mm-hmm. What's it been like then, like working on these like myths or working on the gods and myths basically? Like what's that all been like?
It's a weird process because it's basically just a lot of like sitting down and coming up with very vague ideas, and then sort of spending hours just in a chair thinking in my fucking underwear, just thinking like, okay, now how am I going to make that into a version of that makes sense? Because I mean, like I always have like the bare concepts of like some of the stuff I just described. Like I know like Eden and the Abyss were concepts I've been toying with for a long time, but it took me a long time to actually like formulate those into something tangible instead of just vague hell bad place and vague god man.
Yeah, it's hella interesting. I think like going into a deep dive on it, and I think like as soon as Alex speaks, we can really explore that to a true extent. So, I think one other thing I wanted to ask about actually was the Leviathan. Like Leviathan sounds badass as fuck. How'd you come up with that?
I like the word Leviathan, and I mean, you know me. I'm a slut for cosmic horror, so I think the idea of having like
You haven't watched that episode, by the way. Check it out.
I think the idea of having like the one true God and the actual legitimate creator of everything be basically like an incomprehensible monster that has no idea what it's doing and is basically just farting out the universe as it exists, and that's like the big revelation. Like that's like because I mean I don't want to get into cosmic horror again, but like the essence of cosmic horror is like just that sort of existential dread, and I felt like nothing to me would be more existentially disappointing than finding out that the meaning of life and the center of like the reason for everything is basically that God is an incomprehensibly large animal that is that is basically just farting out the universe.
Oh my god.
So yeah, that was basically that.
Yeah.
Eden was sort of an extension of that because I wanted to. I still wanted. It's they're basically both Eden and the Leviathan are both like representations of my like very stony interpretations of what I think God would be. Because I don't like to talk about religion on the podcast, but I think like just in very stony sessions, I've always felt like if there were something that we could describe as being a god, it would either be like probably something that doesn't totally know what it's doing, or it would be something like Eden, like which is basically a fourth dimensional being, which is more of an observer to reality than like an active participant.
He looks so cool, by the way. I love this drawing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Like I said, that it looks straight out of Hollow Knight, and I love that.
Yeah. I see the use of like the biblical names, and I appreciate it because there's some good biblical names.
There are.
Thank you.
I always love, like, I think no matter what, even though her name has been almost everywhere in a lot of biblical stories and like, you know, stories that we're tying into the Bible, like Lilith is almost always a very good name.
Yeah.
It's such a good name. I love it. I use it way too often.
Yeah.
A part of my process, like it's so strange because a part of my process has basically been like either I want to find something that connects like in sort of religious imagery to the story, like Eden, Garden of Eden, all that jazz, and like Lilith. Can't get into why Lilith's called Lilith, but and then there's also like Azazel. I can't totally get into why Azazel's called Azazel, but like if you look up, if you know what the Hebrew meaning of the word Azazel is, then that might give you some hints. I don't know. But there are other characters like the wind god is called Gilgamesh. That has no meaning that has no correlation to the actual Gilgamesh. I just thought Gilgamesh was a name that sounded cool.
I wanted to ask because Gilgamesh is like that was one of the first like epic stories written ever.
Yeah,
I think if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
It's one of the most one of the first epic poems. His name being Gilgamesh has literally nothing to do with the epic poem or Sumeria or anything like that. It was just essentially his character is a very strong god, and I just wanted a name that evoked strength. And I thought Gilgamesh sounded right up the alley. Same with the forest god Byzantia.
Yeah,
which could be seen as a reference to the Byzantine Empire. It totally isn't, because when I wrote that, I was under the impression that the term Byzantium meant like paradise or some shit, and I wanted to have his name evoke that sort of thing. But then I found out it has nothing to do with that at all, but I just kept it because I don't know.
Because it sounds cool.
It sounds cool.
Yeah. There's a lot of like Arthurian legend references in this series as well, and that's the Avalon. No coincidence there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's basically it. That's all I got.
Nice. Round of applause. Round of applause. All right. Main event time.
Hell yeah.
My God. Okay. So I'm gonna start with Katariana. If we have time, I'll go into the Millennium stuff too, because I'm really proud of that stuff and I think it's cool. But we'll start with Katariana. So religion in Katariana is kind of weird, because again, like a lot of things when I was world building this, I wanted to approach it from the perspective that it's a whole planet. So there's not one like religion or like one set of gods in Katariana. There's a bunch of them. There's multiple religions. There's a bunch of different beliefs. Some of them overlap. Some of them intersect. Some of them are completely at odds with each other. And I've also said this before, I think, in previous episodes, but Katariana is also kind of like a bit of like my ideal world when it comes to like political kind of stuff. So one of Earth's biggest conflicts tends to be conflicts between religious groups. So I also wanted to find a way to eliminate those as much as possible. So most of the religions are at least somewhat compatible, I guess, just for that sake, but they're not. Yeah, so I'm just gonna start with the like one of the big creation stories, which is the story of the three sisters, which actually comes from like old versions of my world, because in the original version of Katariana, the solar system that it was part of had 3 suns, and then I got older and realized I didn't know how that would work like scientifically. So I was just like, you know what, for simplicity's sake, they have 1 sun and 2 really bright stars, a la like Sirius, like, that kind of stuff. So the 3 sisters are basically the sun and the 2 brightest stars in the sky, originally the 3 suns. So the one sister that is the sun, her name is Lanu, and her 2 sisters are named Malah and Kanahe. And I haven't like figured out all the details of it yet specifically, but basically at some point in creation, they knew there was going to be at least one planet with life on it. Again, this story comes from before the people of Katariana knew that there was life on other planets in their system. So there was going to be a planet that was supposed to have life on it, and one of the 3 sisters was to become the sun that would be like the life giver to this planet. And so they basically had like a competition to figure out who would become the sun and who would just be the stars in the sky. And eventually Lanu won that competition. Again, I haven't figured out all the details of what the competition is or anything, but that's basically the general plot of this story. And then, yeah, so that's the 3 sisters, and also their names. Lanu is the only one that kept her original name from like the 3 sons. But basically their names are Lanu actually came from the word Luna. I just kind of rearranged it because I was like, a sun named after the moon is kind of funny. So that's where
less
Lanu came
effort too.
from. The other 2,
I appreciate that.
yeah, I thought it was funny. The other ones were actually Legna and Nomed, which are angel and demon backwards. But I changed those for obvious reasons. But then their names are supposed to evoke the same kind of sounds that are really common out of his culture. So the story of the 3 sisters is something that was part of Alahe's culture in the Diamond Dagger. And you can see that with Kanahe, Alahe, they have the same like ending of their names. Malah is the same as Alahe's mother, Halyah. They have the same like ending there again. So I just wanted their names to like kind of evoke that, because a lot of names in cultures tend to come from religious places. So I thought that would be an interesting connection to make there. And then the other like major creator god that exists on this world is Arun, an Arun. Like it's the Arun god. The god isn't themselves Arun, but is worshipped mostly
Now
by the
that would be
Arun and a
funny.
little bit. What?
Now that would be funny.
If the god was also Arun?
Yeah, if a god called Arun was a literal rune. That's funny.
No, Arun. That's the name of the race, the angels.
Oh shit. Okay, ignore me.
Yeah, the angels. I'm calling them Arun or Zaruni. I have too many names because I have too many languages, but that's fine. Their word for their own race is Zaruni, which actually comes from their god Za. Za is in like the Arun culture is basically like the one and only god, the creator of the universe, the creator of the Zaruni, the creator of like the stars, which is like their source of food. Uh, so Za is basically usually depicted as a Zaruni, which is like a vaguely humanoid figure, 3 pairs of arms, 5 eyes in total. They also have, I think, just 2 sets of wings, so 4 wings in total, and often depicted with something that in our culture would probably be like thought of as a halo, but it's supposed to be like there's a star behind their head because they created the stars, and usually depicted dressed in like white robes because white is considered very sacred color to the Zaruni. And I haven't really talked much about the Zaruni, I don't think. But one of the things about them is that all of their names start with the character for Za. The Zaruni also have their own language, actually, which I don't think I've talked about either. Their language is called Zarunita, and it's kind of unique to the other languages. It doesn't have like each of it's like vaguely more similar to like how like Japanese hiragana works in that each character represents like a full sound instead of like what in English we would consider an individual letter. So they have a character for the sound za, and because this is the name of their god and in their religion it's like the sound of the universe as well. It's considered very sacred by their people, and so all the Zaruni have za as like the first character of their name. So that's Za, real quick. Za is also worshipped by the Drak, the like demons, as I've been calling them. But in their religion, he's part of a pantheon of multiple gods. And again, I haven't like put the full detail into the Drak pantheon yet, so I'm not going to talk about that. The next like deity that I want to talk about is Kataria. And so Kataria is, if you couldn't tell by her name, is the character, is the deity / historical figure that the planet Katariana is named after. Basically, the story goes there were 2 planets, like twin planets, that were called, I don't remember what I called them anymore. One was called Stone, and the other one was originally called Darkness, but that's a stupid name, so I'm changing it. But I don't think I have yet. So yeah, there was Stone and the other planet. Stone is actually just the Azat word for, or not the Azat, the Atanic word for home. So basically, it just means like home planet. And that's also where the name of like what the people of Katariana call themselves, which is Stonlorik, which basically just translates to home worlders, or like people from the home world, essentially. But yeah, so Kataria was a princess on the planet of Stone. And she basically realized that the planet was dying, and that there wasn't really anything they could do about it. Like life was struggling to grow. They weren't getting like all the resources they need to keep living. So basically she got all the people on the planet, or as many as she could, together, and she built like a teleportation circle of sorts and brought them all to the other planet. And we're like, hey, our planet's dying. We're like sister planets. Can we live on your planet now? And they were like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. We're going to stick on this side of the planet, but the other side's pretty empty if you want that side. So they settled on the planet. And Kataria was regarded as a hero for figuring out how to do that. So they named the planet after her. And she's still widely worshipped among the Katath people, mostly because she was Katath. And she's also, in this case, believed to be like an actual historical figure. And the reason I call her more of like a deity rather than a god is because, again, she's based on like a historical figure. And also she was a mortal who was, like, in this case it's more similar to like saints in Catholicism, in that she was a mortal, and she was blessed with like holy powers basically that let her save a bunch of people and was therefore deified.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a giant statue of her in the capital of the country of Agrat, which is also where like the Kataria like religious center is, because that's where supposedly she came through the portal. So that's
Yeah.
Kataria.
Can I comment something really quick that I find really fascinating?
Sure.
How clean and like I say clean, but like that trade deal where it's like, yeah, you can have the other side of the planet. Like that's so cool. It is somehow a much better alternative than like the two sides fighting for it. I'm like, damn. Real world's gotta take
I did
notes.
say ideal world, right? I did say ideal world,
Yeah,
right?
but
Obviously,
like,
that's not like exactly how it would have gone down. That's me like simplifying it because I don't have all the details like figured out.
mhm,
Um, Again, this is also like an edited version of the story. In the original one, there was a bit of conflict. And then there was like this creature that came and was about to like kill the leader of the people on the planet, but then Kataria like jumped in front of it and saved the leader, and so everything was fine. But because of like further development I've gone through, that part of the story doesn't work anymore. So
mhm.
I'm in the process of editing it. But yeah, I did want it to be relatively smooth, especially because, there's a lot of issues when it comes to things of like colonization, and especially when like people take over somewhere else and then change all the names of things.
Yeah.
And I wanted to like be careful with how I approached that kind of stuff. So yeah, I
Fair
wanted
enough.
it
It's
to
good to be
be,
mindful.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Something that's sometimes difficult.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm gonna talk about. I think I have two more stories from Kataria that I can do really quickly.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so the first one I'll talk about the first Beastwalkers. This myth would actually be older than the myth about Kataria because Kataria was a Beastwalker. Back on Stone, before it died, there was like a group of people that lived there, and they were like fairly humanoid. They were just like normal people. And then there were a bunch of like animals that were like conscious animals, like they were like wolves that had like the same thought process as humans do basically. And so there were like these two kingdoms living side by side of the humanoids and the animals, the beasts. And there was, again, because there's like a bunch of conflict on Stone, that leads to the death of the planet. The beasts and the humanoids were like, hey, since we're both at risk here, we should like team up to figure out how to save the planet and save ourselves, blah, blah, blah. And so the first humanoids to come up with a solution were named Shifa and Chifa. They were twins, and they approached the beasts, and they were like, I bet if we combined our abilities into like one being, we could do some really cool stuff. So they made a deal with these two foxes, and somehow merged themselves into basically the first Beastwalkers, which were fox shifters specifically. And it became known as Shifa and Chifa, and they brought this ability to their people and to the Beastwalkers, and were like, hey, look what we can do. We've been granted the ability to shapeshift, and now we can do a bunch of cool stuff. And they basically convinced a bunch of their people to do the same thing, and that's kind of how the Beastwalkers emerged as a race, according to their legends. And then the last story I wanted to talk about real quick was the first Watchers, which is a legend from Adahi's village, specifically in the Diamond Dagger. The Watchers was an old term used for the elemental people, the people that can control the elemental magic. And I'm actually going to read a little bit from the first chapter of the Diamond Dagger.
Hell yeah.
So the story goes, the first Watchers were born of the natural gods. There were 4 in that first generation, 1 born from the river with eyes of ice, 1 born from the trees that guard our people, 1 born from the flames that stand in the center, and 1 born on the breath of the clouds in the sky. The Watchers were members of the village, same as any other. They worked as caretakers and hunters, as builders and gardeners, despite the gifts that the gods had bestowed upon them. Everything changed, however, when the Beastwalkers appeared. 4 is not a sacred number, and so the Beastwalkers were initially seen as a blessing, seen as the same as the Watchers. There were 2, making 6, and 6 is a sacred number. And so there were 6 blessed beings of river and tree, of flame and cloud, of wolf and fox, and for a time Macvilras was at peace. Then one day a new Beastwalker appeared. This Beastwalker was different from the others. This Beastwalker was not a wolf or a fox like his companions. This Beastwalker was a Brignac. The Brignac is a formidable beast, bigger than a bear, with fur white like snow and fangs like diamonds. It's the deadliest hunter alive, with pale eyes and a long, slick tail. It moves quiet, so quiet you wouldn't hear it if it was standing behind you. It came in the night, found its companions in the wolf and the fox, and convinced them to turn on the villagers. There would have been many lives lost that night. Many would have died if the Watchers hadn't stopped the wicked Beastwalkers from having their way. From the river came a great wave. It crashed down on the Beastwalkers and soaked them to the bone. If nothing else, they would freeze before the sun rose. But that wasn't all. From the forest came the roots of the trees, and they wound themselves around the legs of the Beastwalkers to hold them in place. Now even the hunters could take them down. The fire pit roared to life, and flames surrounded the Beastwalkers. Now no one could get too close to their dangerous fangs. Finally, the stars disappeared as the clouds descended from the heavens and wrapped around the Beastwalkers. They were lifted into the sky, and the first Watchers sent them away to Ockwell, the realm of the divine gods, to be punished for their crimes. The Watcher Towers were built after this, a gift from Malah. The Brignac were banished from this realm, a gift from Kanahe, and Lanu rose early that morning and blessed Macvilras so that every generation there would be Watchers to fight the Beastwalker, lest they dare to attack our home again.
Nice.
So that's kind of the
Damn, son.
story.
Hell yeah.
The Brignac are, since they were mentioned, I want to talk about them because they're really cool. They're basically these like giant cat-like creatures. They're like super dangerous. And they're considered like divine beings in a sense. And and they've also basically been hunted to extinction on Katariana because they're so dangerous. But there's actually one still in existence, but I can't talk about him because that's spoilers.
Oh man.
Yeah, and I also mentioned Ockwell in the story. Ockwell is again the realm of the divine gods. The divine gods are Lanu, Malach, and Kanahe, because they're from like the heavens, they're part of the heavens, but there's also belief in like natural gods, which give them like the abilities to use their elemental magic, the natural magic, as I talked about in the magic episode. And they're just kind of like they're kind of on like the level of like nymphs and stuff from Greek mythology. Like there's every tree has a spirit, and that spirit is a natural god kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got
And
it.
like every mountain and every river and every blade of grass and every animal. Yeah, so that's kind of just like a little bit of the myths of Katariana. Do I have time to go into Millennia?
I mean, I don't see why not.
Cool, let's talk about Millennia then. I haven't actually talked about Millennia very much on here, I don't think. Millennia is the world that my other novel, The Crown Upon My Head, takes place in. And basic rundown of that place is it's like this little group of countries that are kind of cut off from the rest of the planet. They're surrounded by these two like giant mountain ranges, on like to the east and the south, and then to the north and the west there's just ocean, and there's not really any nearby islands or anything. So there's like 5 countries in there, and then in the middle of these countries is a giant magical forest referred to as the Millennium Forest. And in the center of the Millennium Forest is where the Guardians live. And the Guardians in this world are kind of like the judges of the afterlife, sort of. They live in a giant courthouse in the middle of the forest.
Ooh, that makes for
And
a really nice visual, actually. Or at least how I'm
yeah,
seeing it.
it's so fun. It's so fun. I love the courthouse and I love the Guardians. They're some of my favorite characters that I've come up with. But yeah, they live in this giant courthouse in the middle of the forest, where and when people die in this particular set of countries in the world, I don't know what's true about the rest of the world because I haven't given it much thought. But in Millennia, when people die, their souls basically walk into the forest, until they find the courthouse, and then in the courthouse they have to wander through a maze. This is where we get a little bit biblical because biblical stories are fun. They have to wander through like a maze that's referred to as the garden, and they have to like Eden. Yeah, it's not a paradise in this world. It's actually kind of terrifying, but it exists. They have to like wander through the maze until they get into the actual courtroom, and in the courtroom they are judged by the guardians and the jury. So in Millennia, there is a pantheon of 13 gods. So I can go through them real quick, like because coming up with names is always fun. So I'm gonna start at the top and then kind of like go back and forth. That doesn't make any sense because I didn't send you any pictures. But
Lovely.
anyway, so they have like a certain order, and like if you go into like a temple of the gods, they'll always be presented in the same order. So at the very top, the first god is Ravala, the goddess of nature. I'm gonna jump between god and goddess. It doesn't really matter. They are gender non-conforming because they're gods. So yeah, you have Ravala, the god of nature. The second one is Arasha, the god of the sun. The third one is Dayasha, the god of the moon. The fourth one is Telna, the god of knowledge. Ebos, the god of war. Marana, the god of mountains. Taurus, the god of stars. Lyamer, the god of the ocean. Thynim, the god of storms. Skaran, the god of discord. Ilis, the god of life. Olai, the god of harmony. And Aksha, the god of death. Aksha is the most important one in the story. The guardians are basically like servants of Aksha. In a sense, like they serve Aksha. Aksha is the one that decides where people go into the afterlife, sort of. So they're kind of important. And some fun lore about the gods. In Millennia, they believe that a god's face can never be truly depicted, and to try is basically considered blasphemy. So it's like you don't depict the face of gods. So usually when gods are depicted, like for example, if we want to talk about Olai, the god of harmony, is also considered the god of like weddings and marriage and stuff. So often they're depicted with like a veil, like a bridal veil over their face. Otherwise, they tend to be depicted facing away from the viewer, like looking behind them or with something covering their face. And they're pretty much never facing the worshipper if the worshipper is like in front of their depiction. The one exception to this is Aksha, who wears a mask over their face with a hood, and is referred to as the forward-facing god for this reason, and is, because of this exception, is considered one of the like scarier gods. Like everyone's kind of scared of Aksha. And the guardians actually also like take this attire into their like outfits, so they always have masks covering their faces and these cloaks with heavy hoods. And then a little bit more after that, I mentioned the jury in the courthouse. So I'm just basing it on like the general like court system where there's 12 members of a jury. Because there's 13 gods, Aksha is represented by the guardians themselves, and the 12 jury members represent each of the other gods in the jury, in like the judgment process. And so each of the gods is represented by one of the 12 jury members. The 12 jury members include the 7 deadly sins, because
Heck yeah.
because I'm weak for it.
They're fucking classic, man.
They're so fun. And then I have 5 other. And then I have 5 other members, which include an angel, a demon, like a reaper type character, like a grim reaper, and then a gardener and the clock, like time itself, basically.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And actually each of the jury members have like their own like lore, like they have like a folklore type legend about them. I haven't figured out all of these yet because this is like a fairly new development in the development of the story. But my favorite one that I've come up with so far is the jury member that represents Dayasha, the moon, is gluttony. And so there's this folklore story that on a full moon, if you're in the Millennia Forest on a full moon, if the moonlight hits you like just the wrong way, you get filled with this insatiable hunger that kind of like takes over your mind, and you'll eat anything in your path. Like people will eat other people, they'll eat like trees, they'll eat like animals that they come across, they'll start like piling dirt in their mouth.
That's some fucked kind of munchies.
Yeah, it's really bad. And then they'll awake in the morning, somehow having survived eating so much. And usually they don't live very long after that. But yeah, that's That's one of the like folklore stories, and it's just referred to among the common people as the hunger. And it's something it's like you know, like you hear about British people and their fairies, or like Irish people and their fairies, and they're like, oh, don't mess with the fairies. That's kind of what like these folklore stories are. It's like, oh, don't go into the forest on the night of a full moon.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be overtaken by the hunger, like that kind of vibe. So that is a rough breakdown of the gods, some of the gods of Kataria, Katariana, yeah, of Katariana and of Millennia.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I guess some questions that I have. You've been
Question
developing.
time. Yes.
Yeah, you've been developing the so like it's pretty well known at this point within the podcast that like you've been developing your worlds for like a fuck ton of time now. Like, just how long really have you been kind of developing the gods and your mythical and the myths surrounding each one? Because I know like Katariana, it's been almost a decade basically, but like
It's been more than a decade, I think.
more than a decade. Yeah.
Here's the funny thing, actually. And this is probably just because, like, I mean, this is basically irrelevant, but I'm not religious. And so I found that when I was world building, religion was actually something I forgot was important for a long time. So the gods are actually pretty new. I'd say Kataria is the only one that has existed for a long period of time.
Mhm.
And this is why, like, I don't have all the religions of Katariana, like, built out and established very well yet, is because I actually didn't really start thinking about it until like a few years ago when I was like, oh, wait, religion has a huge impact on culture. I should probably start thinking about that.
Mhm.
And then I started putting thought into it. So the religion is actually just like I literally forgot that religion was important. So I didn't start working on it until pretty recently.
So give or take like a couple years ago, or
I don't think I really started it until after I started university. So yeah, like 3,
Damn.
4 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like,
God damn.
it's certainly something that like for me I can agree that for like even, and keep in mind like for I wasn't really writing fantasy at the time, but I did know just how important writing, or like how important the, I guess, the religion system was to implement. So like that was a key factor for me in writing my story, or I guess in expanding my story, because like I knew that I wanted to have some kind of like mentor student relationship, but like developing the gods for me at least was quite interesting, because I guess for me gods have always been kind of like magic, and this is, I guess, now going into its own thing, unless Alex there's a few other things you want to add. But
No, I just wanted to say, like, I get what you mean about like the gods being important, and I actually agree because um I found I was kind of stuck with the crown upon my head for a while, and I couldn't really figure out why. And then I think like literally last year in my creative writing class, I submitted a chapter from it to be like reviewed in the class. And at one point, you know, like it's one of those things where when you're writing, sometimes you're just like, oh my God. And you don't even really think about it because that's just part of like the English language. But then when your world doesn't have God in it, then you're kind of like, what would they say in that case? So at the time, I just kind of unthinkingly put gods, plural. Um,
mm-hmm.
and then someone actually wrote on my paper, like circled it and was like, oh, gods multiple, that's so cool. And I was like, oh, actually, I haven't thought about religion in this world at all. I should do that. And then I sat down and like developed the pantheon like really quick and figured out like all the important aspects of it, like which countries are what like worship which gods in particular and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I found that it gave a lot more depth to May as a character. and it's helped me figure out like some of the points that I was stuck on. So like, yeah, it's religion is a huge part of culture, and so if you have like a culture, if you're world building a culture, religion plays a bigger part in it than you might realize. It will dictate like holidays, it will dictate clothing, it will dictate language, it will dictate probably like the calendar system and how people count time. Like religion has a much bigger influence on things than I think a lot of people realize.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's definitely, if you're going into a world building project, definitely keep religion in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was gonna basically elaborate on that and basically agree with you. Like when I was developing Xeno from the ground up, basically, or as a fantasy story, I had to account for religion, but just really how influential the system was. Yeah, like I really didn't think about it like that at first. Like, and you're right, like how it influences how it influences potential, like how it influences such things such as, how people tell the time, holidays, and all that stuff. Like I sure as hell didn't think about it at the time, but now it's really like a really
Yeah.
important thing, because I was basically going to say that the gods in the system, or the gods in a story, for me at least, is basically like magic. If it's written too loosely or if it's written too perfectly, then you can write yourself basically out of anything. And I've stated before how much that bothers me. So, Gabe, how about you? Like when you're when you were writing up when you were expanding on the religion system, basically, like what were you kind of, I guess, what was your kind of headspace going into it?
I've talked about the religions in Ylldrix a little bit. I can't remember which episode it was specifically. I think it may have been the world building episode. I talked about the religions in Ylldrix. But basically, the mindset that I had was basically that like I was going to take the gods and the origins of the universe and sort of like extrapolate them into more religiously sounding interpretations. So like imagining like what characters who had like a sort of vague access to like ancient information might interpret from it. So I talked about how there's the one who's the most relevant to this is the Bosbarek religion, and the Bosbarek is the people who worship Bosbarek. Bosbarek is basically it's a word for Leviathan in I haven't actually decided where the Bosbarek are like most commonly, but essentially the Bosbarek is the word for Leviathan, and they believe that the Leviathan is the only god, that the Leviathan, that more than just a creator, that the universe exists in the Leviathan's digestive system, and that the universe is being created by the Leviathan's digestion, almost. So it's sort of stuff like that. And there's a couple other religions I didn't get into because a lot of those are more like cultural. Like in Titania, they have there's the Thomist. I also mentioned that a couple episodes ago. The Thomist in Titania is the vampire nation I mentioned last episode. They're like the steampunk vampire guys, and they essentially their belief is that there is sort of in like a sort of vampiric chosen one who is essentially like a messenger for God and leads vampires to salvation. In the context of like modern Titania, it's not a very commonly held religion because most Titanians are like they're sort of a war nation. I didn't mention this while I was talking about it, but there's basically in Ylldrix there's a constant cold war between the two biggest nations, Titania on the east of the planet and Lancaster on the west, and they've been in a like a half a century long ceasefire in their Cold War. I don't know. I forget how I tangented into this. But basically, yeah, they don't really hold on to their religious ideals as much anymore. But there's still a lot of like the Thomist ideals still carry into their culture pretty prevalently, even if they don't believe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, there's been like there have been so many things for me to consider like creatively in terms of writing out a religious system, and even like myths, like that's been super fascinating. And I think like I didn't mention this before, but the way that I've kind of I've kind of made telling myths to be more interesting was through comics, or basically the Mist comics. And that is, kind of retelling the story of the gods and the mystics, and kind of reimagining like some of their more famous stories throughout history, and even like ones that are just like creative fan fiction, basically. That has given me plenty of leeway to, I guess like we're focusing on myths, but like, yeah, it's given me plenty of opportunities to tell unique stories while I'm telling a story. Right, like it helps me expand on. I think the Mist comics are really the ones that helps me expand on the gods, because as of on the gods themselves, because as of right now, the book is primarily focusing on Linnea and her mortality. I guess like her, her, or like the qualities about her that make her human, her personality, her attitude, her guidance, all that stuff. But through the Mist comics, telling myths and sharing how and sharing how the gods are these awesome like badasses has given me the way to do that. Like it's allowed me to like showcase off their powers, and like yeah, I guess it's just not been only a showcase for me to like show off like while the story goes on, but it's definitely like I think it's been a way for me to do multiple things at once. And whether or not that pays off completely in the end, in terms of the myth aspect to it, is still up for debate right now. But yeah, like when it comes to myths, what's it been like, or what's that been like for you guys?
For me, I find that I tend to be more interested in like the myths at like a folklore level, if that makes sense. Like less like like if we want to compare it to like real life, less what's in the Bible and more what do people actually talk about,
Yeah, so it's like stories
to
around
use
a campfire,
Christianity
probably.
as an example. Yeah, exactly. Again, just using Christianity as an example, because I feel like most people here are probably familiar with it.
Mm.
But like, yeah, I found because that I've also found that tends to be more what people actually focus on in terms of religion. Like people will have their holy books and their religious books, and there'll be like certain stories out of it that they focus on, and those stories get retold and retold until they're not actually accurate to what's actually written in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, there's always like the folklore stories, like like the Irish and their fairies. um and you have those here too, where people are like, don't go into cornfields at night because who knows what's out there. And like that kind of stuff, like the kind of stuff that people like, not that people don't care about what God thinks or whatever, but people tend I've in my experience, people tend to be more concerned with, I guess if we want to keep using Christianity, people tend to be more concerned with like the demons that are on earth, that are like tempting, that are doing dangerous and harmful things.
Yeah.
Those tends to be like the focus of like at least the common people, lay people, the like normal everyday person. And so that's kind of been more my focus in terms of building up myths, is like what do the people say, rather than what do the like the clerks and the priests say, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gabe, how about you?
Well, it's sort of tough to sort of carry over a lot of folklore stuff, because the general way that Ylldrix is, there's like, well, there's a couple factors that go into it. A lot of
I also want to say, sorry, before you cut into this, I'm not like saying that like the big myths aren't important or aren't
oh no,
interesting.
I know.
That's just what I've personally been focusing on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no,
But
I know.
yeah,
I'm
myths are also cool.
I'm bouncing off that to sort of explain. I'm not saying like oh well I disagree. I'm just uh, I think the way that Ylldrix is that I think that's more, a lot of people have, like I said, Ylldrix is sort of like the general plot of Ylldrix is that the main characters are just trying to prevent more war from breaking out. The world's in a state of peace when the story starts, but it's been basically just centuries of people of petty power squabbles.
Yeah.
So there isn't a lot in the way of like religion, because a lot of people just don't have like centralized beliefs, but there are a lot of characters who carry like certain philosophies, and there's quite a few characters who will carry like the philosophies that religions suggest, and like the philosophies that religions like or like the beliefs that a religion might promote. So like, again, with the Titanians, I know you guys, I'm only bringing up the Titanians a lot because that they got a lot of support in the last episode, so I know you guys like those, like that, so I'm just bringing them up, catering to the fans.
And we love the vampires, okay? Top
Yeah,
tier
absolutely.
content.
No, yeah, I know. Listen, I love them too. As soon as I wrote the idea ice steampunk vampires in my little fucking notebook, I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna focus on this predominantly over everything else. But yeah, they're. I mentioned this briefly in the last episode. I wasn't joking. They're basically communists. They have a very like sort of communal ideology because their whole existence is essentially based on like that vampirism resulted from groups of people who were struggling in these horrific subthermal environments, like coming together and figuring out ways to survive that just through evolution evolved into vampirism. So they have a strong sense of community, and they have a strong sense of like of the Thomas religion, like being an idea of like a leader who would like lead by example, and not through power or fear, but like this sort of sense of like true godly leadership. And they very much like carry that through to how they act. That sort of influences how, like, why their war with Lancaster is not, I don't want to call it a religious war, but it is kind of a religious war, because they have like, essentially they have a fundamental disagreement on the way that life should be with Lancaster, which has over centuries just escalated into this international conflict.
Can I go back to my earlier point about the ways that religion influences us in ways that we don't even realize? Because I thought of another one that's also really important.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Behavior, especially around like sex and sexuality, is very, very heavily influenced by religion.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
I've also found, just like kind of off the top of my head, religions that have like pantheons of gods, like more than one god, tend to be more pro-sexuality, and religions that have like a singular god tend to be more like anti-sexuality. Sort of. Not like, obviously not like for sure, but just like off the top of my head, I just think that's really interesting. But yeah, like
That's
like I
definitely
mentioned,
true, though. I mean, the Greeks were the horniest motherfuckers.
Yeah, man, I didn't even think
just
about
like
that.
religion like will affect the way you think about well, not like religion specifically, but like religion and as it's taught in a society definitely affects the way people think about things like that and
Mhm.
about like
Yeah.
family and about relationships. And it has such a big influence on so many things. And it's like once you start thinking about it, you're like, oh, wait, wow, I didn't even think about that before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird you mentioned that because actually when I'm thinking back on it, there's a huge influence from, or like I guess religious wise, or that interferes in Porter and Magnus' relationship. So while I haven't fully developed the relationship, there has always been something about worshiping Manarwe so that it is almost exclusively you dating or like being with another hymnic. Is I guess there's just something about like the purity in the flame or something. I don't know. That's just something that I'm kind of remembering. And because Porter and Magna had a relationship at one point, that basically just compromises the whole thing because the whole idea with hymnics marrying and dating is essentially and keep in mind I haven't fully developed it, but my basic plan has always been like under Manarwe's or under the goddess Manarwe, it is you find that one person for life. It is there is hardly ever any change to that. Like once you as a hymnic have decided to like have found your soulmate basically, or you found that one person that like you are for sure committed to, then it's for life. And it's almost always mutual, but the thing is having Magna fall for Porter makes it a lot more complicated because Illyrians are a lot more, I guess, relaxed with the whole for life thing. Like it's very similar to I guess us nowadays, right? Like you're free to date whoever, you can divorce whoever. If it doesn't work out, you can do so on a whim almost. And that really does put a strain on their relationship. And I'm hoping to develop that in a future installment because it takes part in, or the reason why I'm discussing this is because with the Philippines, which is what him is largely based around, it's not an absolute for life thing, but basically because the Philippines is still predominantly Christian, it's pretty much you can't separate once you've married. It's the person you love most for the rest of your life. Basically, it's the things that the church has basically implemented, right? Or it's basically the church has kind of taught of. And there's also the whole like soulmate thing where you found the person that your soul has been kind of meant for, but how all of that, or like that's just within two different islands or that's just within two different continents as far as everyone or everything else goes. Like I'm not sure if I've implemented how I guess like sex and religion works for Zur or for Chaos or for for Fora or anything. I think I elaborated this in a previous episode, but conception is or can be done in one of two ways. So it's either the I guess biological way, so you got a man and a woman, or it is as a gift, because and I found, so I've developed a proper backstory for this. So I say a gift because in my world, or specifically within Chaos, which is the land of the Chaotix, they are the ones who worship Adria, who is originally a chaotic, and Adria was infertile at the time that she was anointed to godhood. And as a gift, Alluvia and Adria created a system so that those who were worthy of bearing children didn't need to go through it biologically. So, two men can have children, two women can have children. anyone who doesn't identify with the binary could have children at their whim. And that basically meant that sex was completely a for pleasure thing. But when it came down to ultimately carrying your legacy, like that's something that religion has a huge influence of. Like, how is it that you treat the future? Have you guys thought about that actually? Like, if we were talking about conception and how.
Yeah. The reason I brought this up actually, how it ties to religion or just in general?
Just in general. I guess in relation to your story, obviously. Like, it's fine if you haven't. I'm just,
Well, no,
it could just be like a very small detail.
It's sort of it's never really come up for me because I don't know. It's never been something that was super on my mind of conception. I felt like I don't know.
Yeah, it's not really one of those things that you kind of think about.
It's not. Yeah, it wasn't something that was like super on my mind, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair.
For me, because I've kind of because my world kind of dips its toes a little bit into the science fiction and the alien. It is something I've thought about a little bit. But for the most part, I'm like, if they're basically humanoid, then I'm just gonna keep the same system. I think in like the modern version of Katariana, which is supposed to be like slightly more futuristic than Earth, I think they have discovered ways to do it artificially almost, where like instead of needing like a sperm and an egg, you can have like stuff from like two people that couldn't necessarily have a child biologically and still like make a child using their genes and stuff. But beyond that, it's basically just as it is. When it comes to like the Zaruni and the Drak, because they are, not humanoid and they're like Ylldrix beings, they don't both of those races are like reproduce asexually, and don't like they can have sex because they can like control their body and like change it on a whim basically, but they both of those races reproduce asexually and not like very often because they're both very long-lived races. So like I've mentioned, the Zaruni came to Katariana like a long time ago, and most of the ones that came to Katariana are still living there like thousands of years later. It's the same people.
Got it.
Just living in their little balls of light. But yeah, they reproduce using like light and stars and stuff. I don't know. I haven't figured out the details.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Conception. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to say before I forget about this, the reason I actually brought up like that stuff in the first place is because in Millennia, in the Crown Upon My Head specifically, I kind of base like the country that May is from on like England and France mostly. And one of the things that I found myself really struggling with was the fact that because England and France, when you think of them in like a fantasy European sense, they're very heavily influenced by Christianity. And because Christianity doesn't exist in Millennia, I was trying to figure out ways to like explain some of the more typical European behavior and like dress code and gender roles, without having it there, and it's very difficult.
Okay. There's one there's one other thing that I wanted to touch on in terms of like how religion impacts, or like how how the gods and myths of our world kind of impacts like how it all plays out, and that is through conflicts. I think specifically through war. And Gabe, I think you had touched about this briefly within your thing, but for me, I don't think I ever did that. And I guess very briefly, because I have 9 gods that essentially came up together, it's kind of interesting to like even think about like what kind of conflicts the like mortals would be getting into, right? When you have the gods who are freely able to, they don't just like have their control in like within the planet, but they're also able to quite literally, intervene in mortal affairs if need be. So like, I guess looking into it, like how is it, and like I'm not about to bring up a specific example because I don't have much of any, but like how is it that how the mortals carry on the name of a god? How does that kind of affect how the gods are viewed, and like how is it that conflicts are fixed? Because obviously throughout history there have been many religious wars, and all of which have been influenced by their own intentions. So I'm thinking like, damn, I wonder how Hymnix and Zurans would go to war, and I'm wondering how like Illyrians would go to war with the Atroxians or something, because obviously like obviously like I don't want to have a world where everything is completely peaceful between every single nation. There will be conflicts, but like when it is multiple gods, that just makes things a lot more interesting, because then I don't know if I would just be creating more of an issue for myself, or if I'm maybe not tapping into that potential enough, I guess. But yeah, maybe that's the thing, religious conflict.
Mm-hmm. Trying to think about that, because I mean, it's like I said, a lot of the I don't know if there's like sort of religious based conflicts. Do you mean like crusades, or like how the gods themselves like impact wars and stuff, like literally?
Yeah, you could do both.
Or
I was thinking along the lines of both. Yeah.
Okay, because in the history of Ylldrix, there's like stuff like crusades, but like I said, there's religion isn't like as prevalent in modern Ylldrix as like it once was. Like the gods themselves are just not super relevant anymore. They're sort of like, I guess, just waiting for. They're just sort of like vibing. I guess you could say a lot of them like the death god Corsho. He basically speaking as when the story begins, obviously, Corsho is basically just chilling in like a castle that's buried deep within a mountain. He's not really doing anything anymore. He basically he doesn't have a realm of death to observe over anymore. He basically just sits alone in complete darkness.
Mm-hmm.
The sex god Paradise is sort of just living amongst humans now, fucking constantly, because that's who he is as a person.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I can't say what Byzantia, Solaris, and Gilgamesh are doing, because that's sort of plot relevant.
Yeah.
The only gods who really impact the wars are Nocturna and River. That's the moon god and the war god. The war god, like, implicitly, obvious reasons, the war god. The way he is sort of interesting though. He's not like exactly like an Ares type figure. He's not like a big, me need war good. The way that he views it is that it's sort of like, it's, as his name suggests, that war is sort of like a river, and it has its natural ebbs and flows, and that like a world that is in constant peace is just stagnant, and his view on it is that you need conflict. So every now and then, every couple centuries, he might like start spinning the wheels again, because that's his belief. But he doesn't like, directly influence the outcome of war. He just gets the ball rolling, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I hear the writer in you coming out in that statement.
And Nocturna does not. Again, she's like a more of a passive god, and she's like the least sort of involved in her godly duties of all of them. But she has a very implicit role in the Titanian Lancaster Cold War, which being that Titan is a nation of vampires and she's the moon god. So there's like there's an implicit role for her to play there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying the word implicit a lot. I'm sorry, my mouth is very dry and I'm just sort of stuttering.
All right, then we can quickly wrap it up then.
Oh no, we don't have to rush. I'm good. My mouth is usually dry by a certain point with these podcasts. It's totally fine. I'm very used to it.
Right.
But yeah, that's what I've got for that question.
Okay. Well, I mean,
My
quickly
turn?
on wrapping up. Actually, I think I didn't really have much else to kind of carry on with anyway. So I think after Alex, we can start wrapping up.
Okay.
So yeah, Alex, religious conflict in your worlds. I think maybe start with Katariana and then go to.
Yeah, like I said, what? Yeah, that's what I was gonna do.
Okay.
But yeah, like I said, with Katariana is kind of, how many times can I say like I said in 5 seconds? Go. Katariana was kind of built to be like my ideal world. And so I kind of wanted to reduce war as much as possible. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen, because I also wanted it to be somewhat realistic. And war happens. I'd say most of the religious conflict, or like god-based conflict in my world, actually comes from the cult, that I can't really talk about, because it has like big spoiler implications. But like to dance around the spoilers, the cult is a Varunique cult. That means it's like it was started by vampires, is about vampires, is followed mostly by the vampires. And as I kind of discussed in the magic episode, the vampires are already kind of a contentious group, because like their magic is generally referred to as dark magic. They have like the whole warlock thing going on. The warlockism could also be considered like a cult, but it's a separate cult from the one that I'm talking about. But they tend to like be very aggressive with their beliefs, and they're like, oh, this is what's going to happen, we're going to make it happen, don't stand in our way. And if anyone's kind of just like, okay guys, chill, they're like, what, you got a problem with us? So they tend to be like the most like aggressive religious group. I could also talk about like the Zaruni, because the Zaruni are also very, like, they're not like aggressive, but they're very set in their beliefs, and they refuse to consider that they could be wrong, and they refuse to like listen to other people's beliefs and stuff. But the Zaruni are also very isolated from a lot of the rest of the world, so it tends to have less of an impact. Also, if people did try to fight the Zaruni, it would go really badly, because they're kind of, eldritch beings made out of pure light, so they could probably blow up the whole planet with like a snap of their fingers if they wanted to. So that hasn't happened, fortunately. But yeah, the cult is definitely the biggest source of conflict in general, not even just like religious conflict, just like conflict in general in the world. They're definitely the perpetrators of that. In terms of millennia, they're definitely have a very like war heavy past. Like I said, there's like the 5 nations that make up millennia, and at the moment they have an alliance actually that's been in place for, I want to say like about 700 years, if I remember correctly. Let me pull up my notes about that real fast. Yeah, they have like an alliance going on, the Millennium Alliance, named after the land. But yeah, so they have the alliance going on, where it's to protect themselves from the Guardians primarily, because they're terrified of the Guardians, and they're terrified of like magic and stuff. So it's to kind of it's to ally the normal people against the divine beings that live in the haunted forest in the middle of their land. But like it's super tense all the time. Like the leaders of the 5 nations don't trust each other. This is actually like a bit of a point in the novel where May's father, who's the king of the country of Gelland, believes that 3 of the other countries are like conspiring to take over his country and one of the other countries. So he's like, we should band together so that they can't take over. And so they're constantly on like the edge of conflict. In terms of the gods, there is a war god that they would attribute this to. But like my approach to gods in this world and in most of my other worlds tends to be pretty hands off. So they couldn't say, like, they would attribute the conflicts and the wars to Abos, but they wouldn't be able to prove it, I guess. And then I've also talked briefly about like the depictions of the gods, and like, they can't show their faces, but the 5 different countries also have very different cultures, and they all tend to depict the gods very differently. And that sometimes causes conflict where they're like, no, the gods don't look like that, they look like this. But those usually tend to be more petty squabbles that are solved by priests being like, well, they're a god, they can look however they want.
If only it were that way in real life.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, I think, yeah, like I said earlier, I don't really have much else to kind of carry on, so I think we'll start closing up. I had already done like a lot of the plugging and stuff early on in the beginning, so I guess I'll quickly, if anyone's made it this far, man, you have a lot of insight into 3 works in progress. Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
But yeah, like I had already said in the intro, all of our social media, both individually and collectively, can be found in the description. And because it's been such a long episode, I think it's because it's been such a long episode and a long season in general, I think we'll just kind of leave it there. So until season 3, whenever that starts, we'll be here. We may or may not be working on what we're working on as we talk about these stories, but we'll be working on something. So yeah, hopefully it's been a long year, but yeah,
I guess an understatement.
Yeah, so with all of this being said, thanks for listening,
off?
everyone. I'm doing it. Is there another way I do sign-offs?
I don't know. We usually say something. Are we skipping that?
No, I said in the
Like
beginning because I knew that it was going to be a long episode.
No. I mean, like, we're usually like, oh, what's your one final thought on this thing, or what's your favorite thing about whatever?
I mean, like, I initially didn't want to because it's been such a long episode, but I guess yeah, we can squeeze in a really quick one. Ooh, okay. Since it's the end of season 2. What are some topics you guys want to see? You guys want to talk about in season 3?
Oh, I already know what my answer is.
I want to do thing. I want to start doing like character breakdowns.
I want to do the least favorite characters episode. I've been begging you to do that episode for decades.
All right. Okay. Yeah, I think I know which one Alex is wanting to do.
I really want to do an episode talking about queer baiting because it's fucking Supernatural ended yesterday as of this recording, and goddamn, I want to talk about it. 'Cause I'm so mad.
It hit the trifecta of queer baiting. It had Castiel queer baiting, and it had, you know,
it had sibling
queer baiting.
Yeah. There was a lot
Plus
of things.
for
wrong
your
with
gays,
that,
can't forget that one.
Oh my god. Yeah, I'm excited to do like author breakdowns and like just really talking about their work. Because I want to
say on y'all's behalf that you two just need to set aside like a day and just scream about Sarah J. Maas. Just get it all out. Just get it out of your fucking system.
Okay, fine. I think at that point I really need to like read through A Court of Thorns and Roses then. Because I've read through all of Throne of Glass. See, no, for the breakdown I kind of have to force myself to.
All right,
so I'll
tell you what. Until Cyberpunk comes out, I will read Throne of Glass so that I can join in on this. Oh
my god.
That's your deadline. Once I'm done, Throne of Glass. The first book at least.
All right. Okay. Well, see, the thing is, though, you now have a public audience.
I'll try
too.
Yeah, I do.
I'll also try to finish the last book before this conversation.
I don't know if I can.
Hey, Sarah, if you've been listening to these podcasts and you've admired the fact that I'm sort of the black sheep in here and I don't like join in on the punch buggy in of your books, well, get ready for that to end, because I'm going to read your book and I'll join in on the pile driving on the morrow.
Have a good night, everybody. I think we're done here. You guys want to say good night?
Good night.
Good night.
All right.
Night.
Season 2.